introduce him.
No,
Thank you. Danny, I was going to sing along. You know, Sonny James is a great guy. His real name's Sonny James Loden, and growing up, everybody called him Sonny. And his parents had a little store there in Hackleburg, and I'd save my money, walk to town, and tell Mr. Loden what model car or model airplane I wanted, and he'd get it for me. And when the tornado came through, hit Hackleburg in April 2011, there were only 4 buildings left in the whole town. And it's your typical little L-shaped main street. And one of them was Mr. Loden's store. So I was very happy when I got up there to see that. First of all, I want to say something about Spencer Backus. I've never run for office before, so I didn't know what the transition would be like, but this man and his wife, Linda, have been absolutely wonderful. And I just think he gave us 22 great years of service, and he continues to serve, and he has been a huge help to me. So thank you, Spencer. And I also want to recognize our first intern, Robbie. And I'm shocked that you're up this early, but very pleased to see you here. I'll get right into what's going on in Washington. Sally mentioned I'm on the Budget Committee. That's been one of the most enjoyable assignments that I've had, and I think you probably are not surprised because I'm a nerd. I get into the numbers. Numbers mean something. But it was an opportunity to really learn where everything is in the federal government. And we have a fabulous chairman in Tom Price that I think is a rising star in the party. He's a doctor from over in Georgia, just a great, great guy to work with. And he's given me a lot of opportunities. And coming from a think tank background and coming into the Budget Committee when we were having just the Republicans meeting and going through, you literally go through every section of the federal government. And having the opportunity to lay ideas on the table and see them come to fruition. I didn't put out a press release on this and haven't talked about it. Really, I don't think Ray in the media. But when we went into the final budget hearing, it's called markup. It's where when you're in the majority, like we are, the minority party comes in, they'll have amendments that will drag the process out into the night, and the Democrats came in. I think they had 35 or 37 amendments. And at the last minute, the House Armed Services Committee sent a letter to the Speaker and every member of the Armed Services Committee, which is the largest committee in the House, and told the Speaker unless the Budget Committee added another $16.5 billion to military spending to the defense budget, none of them would vote for it, which meant it couldn't pass. And I don't know that I've ever heard of one committee doing that to another committee. So you had that committee basically throwing 24 Republicans under the bus, including the chairman. And 5 of us refused to support that amendment. So we started at 10 o'clock in the morning, with all of the Democrat amendments, voted them all down. I was the lead on the opposition on 2 or 3 of them. And 10:30, we still didn't have an agreement. The committee office here in my office in Cannon office building, and I worked all day trying to come up with $16.5 billion. Every time I'd come up with the money, somebody said, "Well, you can't move it from that fund to that fund. You can't break that cap." You know, it's just Congresswoman Marsha Blackburn offered an amendment, called me over and said, "I've got an amendment I think will help," and I got the amendment on the agenda. We got it passed, and they said, "Well, it won't help this year. It might help next year." And about 10:30, the chairman of the, or the chief of staff of the budget committee comes over and he says, the majority leader would like to speak to you, would like to talk to you. And generally at 10:30 at night, it's not a social call. So I said, well, where is he? And he said, he's in the budget office, which is next to the hearing room. So I go in, and I really like, I know we bash Boehner and we bash McCarthy, and I don't agree with them. And my vote Thursday and yesterday, I think, is indicative of that. But I never make it personal. And I'm always trying to find a way to make things work. And they know that. And I went in to see Kevin McCarthy's the majority leader, and sat down with Kevin. The Democrats had brought in about a half a gallon of bourbon, and a couple of them had gotten into it pretty good. I think most of them ran it every day, but some of the policies that but anyway, I sat down with Kevin, and he said, Gary, you're going to move up fast. He said, everybody trusts you. If he didn't say anything else, that was enough. Because, and Spencer will tell you that is one asset that if you've got, it's more valuable than anything else. Because they know that if you tell them you'll do something, you'll do it. And I told Kevin I didn't want anything. I just wanted to help. But what was being done was not right. And we talked a little bit, and I told him I'd keep working on it. And when I left that meeting, walked out in the hall, there were a couple of the other guys who wouldn't vote for the amendment in the hall, and another member. So I brought them into my office, got another chairman on the phone, and suggested that we pass, tell them that if they'll pass the budget that we agreed on, that we could send the budget to the Rules Committee the next morning, add the amendment and rules, and then the whole conference would vote for it and on it. Now the problem was that $16.5 billion is pocket change relative to the budget. Okay, it's the principle that they were going to ask us to pass a budget that we didn't have, that wasn't paid for. And they wanted 24 of us to take the fall for it instead of the whole conference. So we called the chairman in. He said, I think that'll work. Next morning, 8:15, 8:30, I was asked to go back to McCarthy's office and sat down with him. He said, Gary, we're going to take your deal. And that's how we got the budget out of committee. And with all due humility, there are not many freshmen that would have known to do that and would have known how to use the process to make it work. Now, we've got a new CBO director. The previous director of the Congressional Budget Office was Doug Elmendorf. He's basically a Democrat. If we had the new guy, Keith Hall, Dr. Keith Hall, score this budget, the $16 billion wouldn't matter. It's not even a rounding error. But that's one of the things that we were able to do. There's another thing, though, that I think is very important to us as a country and to this state is back in the mid-'70s, Congress passed a law prohibiting the export of crude oil. Okay, this was when OPEC first reared its head, and we thought that we were going to run out of oil in 15 to 20 years. We were going to run out of all these natural resources. And I was able to get it into the budget as a policy statement that we would repeal the ban on crude oil. Well, I've got Democrats reaching out to me now that want to do that. And that's because this country, and y'all heard me all during the campaign talk about one formation holding 3 trillion barrels of recoverable oil. That's 3 times what the entire world's used in the last 100 years, and the federal government owns over 75% of it. So we got folks reaching out on both sides and wanting to do this. There's a report came out last year from another think tank in New York, IHS. There's a guy named Daniel Yergin works for them, and they projected that if we repeal the ban, that it would generate $29 billion in government revenues next year and $1.3 trillion over the next 15 years. Well, I was in a meeting Wednesday with Speaker Boehner, and I told him, we were talking about the Highway Trust Fund that's coming up. The Highway Trust Fund is set to be insolvent at the end of this month. Now, I think because of we haven't spent as much money as we thought, and we've had a little more revenue than we thought, that might be pushed back to September. Philip Weidermeyer's shaking his head because he's been working this rear end off trying to get the Northern Beltline built. But we're in this meeting and talking about it, and I told the speaker, I said, you know, we've got, the federal government has all these natural resources, particularly oil. I said, we ought to take a percentage, a portion of the royalties that we would get from these oil reserves and put it into the Highway Trust Fund. And I told him about the IHS report. And he said, man, that's great. We need to talk about that. Well, when he was leaving the floor Thursday morning, before I voted against the rule, he left the floor, and then he comes back in and he says, Palmer, you've got a great idea. We need to follow up on that. And I said, well, I'll set up a meeting to come in and see it. So I think that's pretty good when the speaker's coming back to get you. And for a good idea, not for something else. He may be coming back to get me because I voted against the rule. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But that's really what I think how I can best serve this district and best serve the country is to put these ideas on the table. And it's amazing to me that just how many members of Congress that didn't know we had a law prohibiting us from exporting crude oil. So that's been kind of fun. And then Sally mentioned I'm on oversight and government reform. I guess everybody in here is aware of the latest cyber attack against the federal government. They went through the Office of Personnel Management. At least 4 million records of federal employees were tapped into, civilian federal employees. Turns out that there was another attack that got into our military personnel. That was just announced yesterday. An interesting thing about how this happened is that the Office of Personnel Management sent out a memo because individuals, employees throughout the federal government were using the federal internet to access their personal email. And the Office of Personnel Management, OPM, sent out a new dictate saying that you can no longer do that. Well, the union representing the federal employees filed a grievance, and the arbitrator told OPM that they couldn't deny their employees access to the federal system for accessing their personal email, and that's how the hackers got in. And we're having a hearing next week in Oversight and Government Reform. We've got 4 hearings next week. I think this one will dominate everything we do during the week because this is, and you're talking about China and aggression. We believe this is China. And by the way, China is not in the trade agreement. I think Obama would like to have them in, but that's probably a few years down the road. This TPP does not include China. But I've also been very involved with the Science Committee and OGR and hearings with the EPA. I am not on the EPA's Christmas card list. We've really gone after them. It's almost like shooting fish in a barrel sometimes because we bring our witnesses in, and there'll usually be 4 witnesses, and the Democrats get to have a witness. And we had one hearing where their witness was a guy with the Environmental Defense Fund, and it was all about how terrible hydraulic fracturing is. Now, this is how we've created this energy revolution in the country, is through the technology that's been developed to reach oil that we never would have gotten except through hydraulic fracturing. And they were talking about the earthquakes in Texas and earthquakes in Oklahoma and earthquakes in Colorado. And then they start talking about methane emissions at the wellhead from all these hydraulic, these fracking wells. And being a freshman, I'm a little bit down the pecking order for asking questions. So I sit there with my iPad, and coming from a think tank background, I know where to look for stuff, and I just started looking up the history of earthquakes in Texas and Oklahoma and Colorado. Rick's from Oklahoma, and you know what, Rick? They started recording earthquakes in Oklahoma in the early 1800s, and you had a big one in 1835 from the New Madrid earthquake. The Mississippi River flowed backwards, and they started recording earthquakes before the Alamo fell in Texas. And they had a major earthquake in Dallas in 1890, and then they had what they called earthquake swarms in the mid-1800s, and they didn't start recording them in Colorado till the mid-1800s, a little later. And then they had the big earthquake in Denver that broke some windows in 1901. And while I'm doing this, I find a report from the University of Texas, their School of Geophysics. And they had actually looked into whether or not hydraulic fracturing causes seismic activity, and they said whatever it is almost undetectable and harmless. And one of the witnesses for our side was the head of the Railroad Commission in Texas, which is an oddly named commission because they're Natural Resources Commission. And I asked her, I said, you know, are you familiar with the history of earthquakes? And she said, sir, you've done your research. What she didn't know is I did it while I was sitting there. And called one of the science staff over and I said, type in your email address, email this to yourself, print both these reports front and back in color and bring them back. And so I held that up and I said, and while we're on the topic of methane emissions, I said, the University of Texas Center for Geophysics did a study in collaboration with a major national group and found that we've reduced methane emissions at the wellhead by 70% over the last 10 years, and that the new technology captures virtually all of it at the wellhead. And the Democrat witness is sitting there, and he had been hammering the methane, you know. And I said, that other group was the Environmental Defense Fund. I said, sir, are you familiar with your own report? That just kills them. I mean, it's hard for me not to break out in a big grin. Yeah. And you know how hard it is for me to smile anyway. So they're, and then the Democrats, their whole line of questions changed, and they started attacking these people's credentials. So it's been kind of fun on that end. And then on health care, I think all of you know that we're at any time this month, the court's going to release their decision in King v. Burwell. And we're anticipating that they're going to say that the subsidies in the states that didn't set up the exchanges are unlawful. We think that they will have a grace period at least through the end of September, which is the end of our fiscal year, so people will still be able to pay for their insurance. And they may extend it possibly another 12 months after that, maybe a little bit longer, I'm not sure. But we had a meeting day before yesterday with, again, the majority leader and the chairman, John Klein, of the Education Workforce Committee, and Fred Upton, the chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, to talk about what we're going to do, and we do have a plan. And we're going to work through the budget. We've passed the budgets, but we're in reconciliation, and health care is at, Obamacare is at the center of reconciliation, working toward repealing it and replacing it. So we do have a plan. One of the tougher things that we're dealing with is that practically every agency has a complete disdain, disregard for the authority of Congress. And I'm talking about from the EPA. They're making laws and just with no regard to what Congress thinks, to the Federal Communications Commission with this new net neutrality. They know that we can't hold them accountable. So we've launched a special subcommittee, new committee that's dealing with agency reform. There's about 25 or 30 on the committee, and they've asked me to be on that. And they asked us to be willing to take on an agency, and I thought, now who would I want to take on? I finally came up with one, the EPA. So, but Lamar Smith, the chairman of the Science Committee, there's only 4 chairmen of committee chairmen on there, and Lamar Smith's on there. And we're going to take that on, and I'm excited about that. It's a longer term thing. We're not going to change it in a week or two, but we've launched it. I've also introduced legislation about something that's pretty technical. It's called ICD-10. Are there any healthcare providers in here, doctors? So you know what that is. And it's basically the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid are requiring doctors and hospitals to adopt a new coding system. It's the International Classification of Diagnosis. They're going from 16,000 codes to 63,000 something. And the smaller hospitals and the smaller physician practices, and particularly, this is particularly true of rural healthcare providers, are undercapitalized. They cannot, they're literally having to make a decision between buying health equipment that their patients need versus new computers, software, and getting all the training to implement this diagnostic system. Now, other nations use it, but there's not another nation in the world that ties it to reimbursements. And they've told these doctors and hospitals if they're not ready to get a 6-month line of credit because they might not get paid. And if you go out in the rural areas where I'm from, Hackleburg, Sonny James' hometown, my mom still lives in Hamilton, they're going to lose their hospitals, they're going to lose doctors because 95%, at least 95% of their patients are Medicare or Medicaid. So I've introduced a bill that the American Medical Association has endorsed, and we dropped this last week, and we've got over 40 co-sponsors so far. I think it's going to do well. Now let's talk about trade in the vote Thursday and yesterday. I voted against the rule. That is not something I'm particularly proud of because basically what you're doing is you're voting to give the minority party control of the floor. I won't guarantee that I'll do it again. I won't tell you that I won't do it again. But in this case, I thought it was warranted. Now, I've read portions of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, but, and Spencer will tell you this, we all sign an agreement. When we read classified documents, we will not reveal it. So I can't tell you what's in it. I'll let Jeff Sessions. But one of the things, you have to go to a room in the Capitol, a secure room. It's got a code on the door. The document's locked up. And only you and one staffer who has a security clearance can go with you. My chief of staff went with me. And we went through it. The one thing that I can tell you that's in it is on every section in the fine print, Rick, and I told the senator about this, is a little statement. And again, I'm kind of a nerd. I think the fine print might matter. So I read it, and it says that this document can be transmitted to to people who are authorized to read it by email over unsecured lines or discussed among authorized individuals over the phone on unsecured lines. The Chinese are thrilled to hear that.
Yes, sir.
So I sent a letter to Michael Froman, the president's trade representative, and said, email me a copy. Haven't heard from him yet. And we put out a press release on it, and we'll probably talk to the media a little bit about it, and if he doesn't email it to me, we're going to call him. Okay? It's on every section page, and maybe the senator ought to request one, and maybe some other members. But my problem with this is that, and people think it's just Obama, it's that Congress has purposely over the years delegated way too much of its lawmaking ability. That's why the EPA is out of control. That's why the FCC thumbs their nose at us. It's why the IRS does what they do and think they can get away with it. And plus, it's this administration's Department of Justice. They know they've got covered. They're not going to prosecute anybody. But in these trade agreements, my biggest issue is, and I read TPA, and I brought this up to Paul Ryan. Paul called me and talked to me for about 30 minutes. I've talked to the majority leader. I've talked to the whip and the other folks and made it clear that I think that the members need to have a greater ability to see the trade agreements in process. Now, I'm not expecting to have 435 members of the House and 100 members of the Senate to all be able to get involved and start negotiating trade agreements. That won't work. But when we get to certain points in the process, there ought to be more transparency so that we can fix something before it's in its final form, rather than having to do an up or down vote on a trade agreement that would otherwise be great for the country but has one or two things in it that we just can't stomach. One of which, for instance, is including the nation of Malaysia. Malaysia is the worst nation in the world for forced labor. They're a Tier 3 nation, okay? Tier 3 nations, they've joined ranks with the likes of North Korea and Syria and Iran. I mean, they're repressive. And here we are asking American workers to compete against a nation's industry that's using forced labor. They're also one of the worst for human trafficking. They're also taking shipments of materials manufactured in China, delivered in Malaysia, changing the nation of origin label, and dumping them in the U.S. That's a problem for me. So I talked to them about if we could have amended it, and particularly on the cyber side, the language in the TPA, I want to be clear that it's TPA, I think is weak. In regard to currency manipulation, it says nations should avoid currency manipulation. You should avoid eating donuts. I mean, even though you brought them in. But that's just not strong. So I suggested that we put a provision in that says that any nation that engages, any nation state that engages in a cyber attack against the United States, whether it's a government entity or a private entity will either be excluded from a trade agreement or have sanctions imposed. There needs to be some accountability. And they didn't want to do that, so I may introduce that as a separate bill. And I told some of these guys that the time to do that is now, rather than when we want to negotiate something with China, because it looks like you're calling them out. And really a lot of what the TPP is about, and there's some concerns about this, is that we're isolating China by keeping them out of this agreement. And China's responding. So we've got to take some initiative here, and none of that was addressed. And then you got the final issue of giving the president this authority. And when I talked to Congressman Ryan, I've talked to some of the other leadership about this. You know, the president issued an executive order last November giving amnesty to about 4 or 5 million immigrants who came here illegally. Prior to that, he said, I think Spencer was 2 times, he said he did not have the authority to do that. Yet he did it. Okay? Judge in Texas, a district court judge, issued a stay on his executive order and said that he couldn't do this. It went to the 5th Federal Circuit, and they upheld Judge Hanna. And I told Paul Ryan, I said, you look at how this administration's responding to the 5th Circuit's decision, how dismissive they've been of this. And what they do, it's not only instructive, it's predictive. I said, what makes you think if this guy will abide by the Constitution, follow directly, and honor the Congress, what makes you think that he will abide by anything we put in a trade agreement? And nobody's been able to answer that, so I voted against the rule. And I voted against the trade authorization agreement and voted against TPA. And now we're all in a bind. I am for free trade. I'm for fair trade, equitable. Trading with nations that don't enslave their people to produce their products. It's trading with nations that don't engage in massive currency manipulation like China is. Now, to be perfectly honest, we're manipulating our currency by the quantitative easing and holding our interest rate. That is a form of currency manipulation. And you're always going to have it. But not and somebody when you don't engage in cyber attacks, you don't do benefit. If you want to have equitable trade, then it's got to be beneficial to all the nations involved. And I'm not quite sure that that's where we'll be. So we'll see what happens on Monday when we get back. I will end it with that and add, that people ask me if I'm having fun. I didn't go up there to have fun, except with EPA hearings. But I do feel like we're getting some things done. I think there are people that want to move the country forward. And Kevin Brady, Congressman Kevin Brady, chairman of the Joint Economic Committee, wanted to meet with me, and again, I say this with all due modesty and humility. Sat down with Kevin, he's a great guy. And he said, Gary, he said, we've been watching you. He said, you're unique. He said, there's nobody in this body like you. And he said, I just want to hear some of your ideas. I just want to pick your brain. So we talked about different issues and what we could do. And I said, Kevin, a couple of days before Kevin and I met, somebody had asked me what I'd like to be able to say after 10 years in Congress. And I said, well, I don't know what I'd like to say, but I can tell you what I don't want to say. I don't want to get up one morning and look in the mirror and say, well, Palmer, you've been in Congress for 10 years. If that's all I can say, then 2 years is enough. I mean, if it's just a bucket list, then, 2 years would be enough. What I would really like to have happen is 10 years after I'm gone, someone come up to me and say, Mr. Palmer, you were part of the greatest Congress this country's ever seen. And I said, Kevin, whether or not that will happen is up to us. And I reminded him that in 1959, when the Soviets launched that satellite, Sputnik, it sent shockwaves through the country. We immediately ramped up our space program. We started getting kids in science and physics and aeronautics and math. And the interesting thing is that it was never our goal to catch up with the Soviets. Our goal was to put a man on the moon before the end of the decade. And we did. And despite the low approval rating of Congress, I told Kevin, I said, you and I are part of a body that has some of the smartest people in the country as members. We've got people who've had great business careers, great military careers. They've been successful in law and medicine, academics. I said, we literally, in our own caucus, are surrounded by brilliant people, great problem solvers, great innovators. I said, Kevin, there's not a problem we can't solve if we put our mind to it. But it's up to us. Thank you.
Thank you, too. Thank you.
before the end of the decade. And we did. And despite the low approval rating of Congress, I told Kevin, I said, you and I are part of a body that has some of the smartest people in the country as members. We've got people who've had great business careers, great military careers. They've been successful in law and medicine, academics. I said, we literally, in our own caucus, are surrounded by brilliant people, great problem solvers, great innovators. I said, Kevin, there's not a problem we can't solve if we put our mind to it. But it's up to us. Thank you.